Welcome to our webinar this evening. It is called IMPEDE-PKD and the Making of a Clinical Trial, led by Professor Andrew Mallett. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so very much for the introduction, Jess. That's very, very generous of you. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. And for those who are joining us after the fact, thank you for watching as well. It's a real privilege to be able to give an update and some background and some sharing together of our experiences of doing and running the IMPEDE-PKD clinical trial. From the outset, I would say as an adult nephrologist and someone who subspecializes in genetic kidney disease, I'm a very, I would still argue, not a trialist, but I'm an accidental trialist. I'm learning to begrudgingly accept that. And so IMPEDE-PKD has a really pretty lovely, amazing story behind it, which I'll share as we go through, and also give a bit of an update of where we're at, and hopefully how some of yourselves and friends, colleagues in the community will be able to, I hope, help us over the next couple of months. So anyway, some general big facts that I think many people who are on the call would already be well aware of. That why do a trial like this? Why do a study? So autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease affects 12.5 million people around the world at least, and remains the fourth most common cause for people to need to commence dialysis or kidney replacement therapies. Okay, and that's even in spite of things like the substantial increase in the numbers of people over time needing to develop kidney disease and need kidney replacement therapy from other reasons as well. Things for us to keep in mind is it's not a thing which is just, the decline of kidney function. There are other key components to it. There is the characterization of this exponential cyst growth, as I'll show in another slide, which is causing these enlarged and painful kidneys with often high blood pressure as an early component, in addition to progressive kidney impairment. So it is actually a multifaceted condition, as unfortunately all too many of the patients I care for, and I'm sure many of yourselves have experienced as well. The background for the condition is, well, also trying to understand, where, if you're going to do a trial, do you intervene and do a trial? And this is a really fascinating space. And for us, began back in about 2016. That seems forever ago now, I know, but that was when we began thinking about this here for this particular trial. And as you can see here, there's this almost linear increase in kidney size and volume and cyst burden throughout life. But the decline in kidney function is asymmetric. It's the opposite of that. So it tends to decline in a way that isn't linear, and happens as a later component of the condition when it's already well advanced and established. And so this means, well, when we're selecting an outcome for a trial, so what is the thing that we're measuring to work out if the agent or drug or medicine of interest is actually doing something, it causes some issues. So traditionally, as many may have seen, other trials have looked at, say, kidney size and volume, which is a surrogate marker, a vetted and validated surrogate marker of progression of this condition. Or but at the same time, the criticism of that, particularly from our part of the world, is that someone will never be commencing dialysis based upon their kidney size alone, at least. Nor is it, at least in our part of the world, part of the way that people qualify for directed therapies, such as the existing one that's available for us called tolvaptan. Instead, kidney function is. But kidney function, as you can see here, has a narrow window where it begins to decline, but hasn't declined so far that things are getting out of control, but is declining at a rate where an intervention can potentially result in a change in trajectory, or how fast it's declining, enough to be measured. And these are really complicated things in terms of how you design a trial to work out, well, what's the best way to work out, does the thing actually work? Why is a trial like this needed? I mean, this is a converted audience in many different ways. To date, there's only one treatment, though, for ADPKD that's approved, and we're fortunate to have access to that medicine here in Australia, tolvaptan. But its use is somewhat limited. It is effective for those who are eligible for it, and for whom who are able to sustain its treatment, which isn't everyone. It's not a magic bullet, as I tell many of my patients. There is expense to it at a health system level. It's not available in all countries, and it also has some fairly strict eligibility and side effects depending on where you are and also your own personal circumstance. I include this little table because I saw this obviously many years ago now, 2016, but much of this information remains current. And the key take home from this table from Albert Ong and Sheffield in the UK that I found fascinating is in fact that despite the evidence for the medicine tolvaptan coming from only a very small number of trials, which are very clear in telling us that it works and decreases the rate of loss of kidney function by somewhere between a quarter and a third, the way that it has been approved for use in different countries varies not insubstantially. Even within, a single country, say like the United Kingdom, as you can see here. So in Scotland, the way it's regulated and approved is just a little subtly different compared to in other parts of the United Kingdom, such as England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And so that's another layer of complexity to think about in terms of how we apply medicines that we get evidence for. And this certainly factored into how we've designed this particular trial. Complicated slide, but this is also to show that the things that are going on in the cells in our kidneys for those patients with PKD and also healthy people without PKD, the processes that are telling those cells to do the jobs that they have physiologically are complicated. Now, our understanding of the different things that we can target in processes and pathways within kidney cells that may be relevant for changing the trajectory of kidney dysfunction in people affected by PKD or ADPKD more specifically is becoming much clearer. And as you can see here, there's a few different things. Vasopressin, and that's tolvaptan, is clearly one that we have learned a lot about, but there's others here that have had trials done, such as the mTOR inhibitors, somatostatin analogs. There is talk of CFTR inhibitors, but also here, as you can see, to the far left of that cell is metformin, and it has an impact on a particular pathway, increasing signaling across something called AMPK. Metformin as well, though, why would we repurpose a medicine like this? It's a diabetes medicine, right? Well, it's in wide clinical use. We're very familiar with it. It's an inexpensive medicine. Its characteristics in renal disease and kidney disease is well known in terms of its safety profile and how it should be prescribed. We also don't just use it for diabetes. It's used in other conditions as well, like polycystic ovarian syndrome and the like. Importantly as well, it also doesn't cause hypoglycemia. And so its safety profile is actually something we can be reasonably comfortable with in terms of how we might apply it in a repurposed trial. How does it work if it's a diabetes medicine? This is one of its side stories. Like so many interesting things in medicine and science, it upregulates or increases this thing called AMPK. AMPK, when it's increased, inhibits the expression of something called mTOR, and that's really important for cell proliferation. And that's a thing which in PKD, as you can tell, with cysts forming, the cells are proliferating to generate those cysts. But at the same time, increased AMPK also inhibits CFTR. So this is one of the little channels that sits in those cells lining those kidney cysts, through which fluid is actively secreted into the cysts, so blowing them up, okay, for want of a better term, like little balloons. And it's thought that, well, if it inhibits both of those two separate pathways, and the kidney size and volume and cyst growth is a key component of what drives decline of kidney function in ADPKD, well, that might actually have an effect on kidney function for patients affected by that disorder. Its function is also dependent on time exposure, and also it has weight-based dosing. So depending on your level of kidney function and how big or small the person taking the medicine might be, it also changes too. These are also reasons why in this particular trial, we've chosen to use the extended release formulation of metformin, because it has a short acting, but also a long acting one. The long acting means there's consistent exposure to the medicine throughout the day. We also found at this point, back in 2016, there was growing evidence of this really supportive preclinical and in vitro models of treatment using metformin in models of ADPKD. So what this means is when we have model systems, so a mouse and other, a small pig and other models and cell cultures that mimic basically what we think we see in ADPKD in these other settings, we can apply metformin to see, well, does it actually do something to how the disease works in a non-human setting or a cell culture setting? And I think that's a really important thing for us to know that, okay, it's valid and appropriate to proceed into a potential trial setting. reimagining those diagrams forward to something that's contemporary for now. I love these ones. On the left is the redone version of that same cell. Looks a little bit more elegant and clearly a bit sharper. But this was published in Kidney International by Vicente Torres and his team just last year in 2023. And as you can see in here, the number of pathways were becoming much clearer in terms of where they might impact. And AMPK still at the bottom left of that cell, we can still see there's a growing number of compounds that might actually impact that same pathway. So it's becoming a more compelling pathway for us to explore using either metformin as we are or other medicines potentially down the track. On the right is a nice simplified version of how we think metformin works or may work for ADPKD through its impacts through AMPK through those two separate pathways, which have a positive impact, we believe, in terms of mitigating or slowing down the growth and expansion of those kidney cysts, which is just critical. And that comes from the AJK, the American Journal of Kidney Disease blog, which was fantastic to see after one of the phase 2 trials of metformin giving supportive evidence. Complicated slide, but I put this there not for the detail in the manuscripts, but purely for, as I put across the top, the timeline. So the first time the hypothesis of metformin for ADPKD was raised was in 2009 in an article that was probably forgotten for quite some time. But then in 2011, the first evidence of metformin began to emerge again, this was in a preclinical model system, so a mouse system. And then in 2013, there was the validation of that, in fact, in this letter that was published in Nature Medicine. And that, PNAS and Nature Medicine are high impact journals. So these are the journals that people absolutely will take notice of. And I can still remember in 2013 seeing this about a year later and then raising it with one of my mentors, David Johnson, at the Australasian Kidney Trials Network, and said, oh, is this something that we should think about? And that's really the beginning of where this whole journey began. This is looking in a bit more detail in that initial evidence from 2011. What did it look like? So in section A there, that's a healthy kidney from one of these mice that is not affected by ADPKD. The B is where the mouse has ADPKD and the metformin has been applied as well. And then on the right, in number C, is a mouse with ADPKD who hasn't been given metformin, just been given a placebo, like a sugar tablet or something. And as you can see, there is a measurable way, at least in that initial series of experiments, that metformin may have attenuated the way that PKD progressed and is expressed. The story doesn't stop there, though. More evidence comes. We continue to almost snowball-wise build more evidence over time, and that's an important thing for a definitive trial like the one that we're doing. In 2021, another mouse model system. Again, there's different ways that you can make a model system for ADPKD, and there's always conjecture as to which one is closest to what's experienced by patients and humans. Today is not the day to adjudicate that, but here, this is another one, and again, did show positive outcomes from the use of metformin in a PKD model in mice. And then on the right, a slightly different approach using a different formulation of metformin, similarly in mice presented just 2 years ago at the World Congress of Nephrology, saw something quite similar. So we're building a greater amount of evidence. And in the midst here, there was also been experiments in pygmy pigs. Interestingly, the pig kidney is actually closest, structurally and physiologically to humans. Hence, one of the reasons why it's been a compelling reason for xenotransplantation, as you may have seen in the media over the last year or two. But we can also, from time to time, use it to model human conditions like polycystic kidney disease to get as close as possible an idea of, for a medicine like this or others, might it do something for that condition in humans? In 2021, though, was a big year. One, it was after the pandemic, so it was a big year in a lot of different ways. But here we had some of the first evidence coming from what we call a phase 2 trial, which is demonstrating safety and tolerability of a potential medicine. And this is one of our flagship kidney journals, Kidney International. There was at the same time another phase 2 trial with 50 participants from Denver and Colorado, published in the American Journal of Kidney Disease. Apologies for not including a pictorial of it here because they didn't generate a graphical abstract like this, which tells the story well, I think, but it mimicked this. They basically saw similar things, that metformin was well tolerated in patients with ADPKD. They were what we would say is underpowered, meaning there were too few participants to give a clear signal as to whether it was effective or not, and they were also only at just 1 year. They left the door wide open very deliberately because phase 2 trials are not definitive. They give an indication to proceed to a phase 3 trial, like we're now doing. But the investigators from both of these phase 2 trials, both this one, which is called TAME, and the other one, which is called the Denver study, have been incredibly important in working closely with us and partnering with us to design IMPEDE-PKD in terms of how do you do the active run-in and all these different components that they actually really did the head work to work out for us. So all credit to them, and I think these are really important trials, particularly in this space. So coming back to why is it needed, as I mentioned, this trial, metformin is inexpensive and well known. We understand a lot about how it works, including in a kidney relevant way. Those 2 phase 2 trials have confirmed that metformin is safe to use in people with ADPKD. And importantly as well, our trial, the IMPEDE-PKD trial, we've now been informed that, well, it's appropriate, not inappropriate, to apply co-therapy with tolvaptan. So participants in our trial also, some, not all, but some are also receiving tolvaptan as per standard clinical indication. So we learnt that as well from those phase 2 trials. Our objective is to deliver a prospective, definitive, multi-center, double-blind, randomized control trial of metformin versus placebo. So everybody participating is receiving something. Some are receiving an active medicine, metformin. Some are receiving a blind placebo, which is not metformin. It's an inert thing, and they don't know. And this is in adults affected by ADPKD to determine the effect of metformin on potentially slowing kidney function decline. As I mentioned, it's a phase 3 trial. Australia is fortunately the lead country, and despite being a non-trialist, I'm the global principal investigator, which is great fun. It's been a wonderful way to build lots of relationships with lots of different people and collaborate widely. We're hoping to recruit totally at a global level, close to 1,100 to 1,200 participants, okay? And we're aiming to find a 20% difference or reduction in change of kidney function, okay? And that number is actually what's required to see that at a level of being quite conservative, of thinking of, well, what might the effect of this potential medicine be? We've done that because, as we said, it's a medicine that is off-label, and is a repurposed medicine. So its effect size, how much effect it has, we're presuming might be fairly modest. But even in the setting of fairly modest effect, if that is found, because it's potentially quite cheap, might be very, very applicable as a secondary or supportive therapy in this space. So as you can see here, this is our run through, our simplification of exactly what happens. And this is looking at the, slight modification to this is that we're recruiting adult patients 18 to 70 who are at risk of active progression, as I'll show in a second, with kidney function actually between 38. We amended that as a learning, I also walk through, and 90. So this isn't for patients with more advanced kidney disease than that. And it also isn't for those who at this point in time have preserved kidney function. But again, there's a learning point in that I'll come back to. All participants go through 3 months of what we call of active run-in, which is actually 10 weeks of everybody taking metformin and increasing the dose slowly to the maximum tolerated dose. So that way we know that the people who are giving the gift of their participation and time are actually going to be able to tolerate the medicine. That's a really important thing for us to recognize. And at the end of those 10 weeks, stopping the medicine to wash out, we would say, for 2 weeks. And then at week 0, the beginning of the following 2 years, they get randomized. So there's an electronic platform that, divides all participants into one group or the other and are provided with the investigational product. Half of those participants, it's metformin at the maximum tolerated dose from the run-in. The other half, it's a placebo. And then we follow for 2 years, and this is designed to be fairly non-invasive. So, the number of visits through this 2.25-year period is actually, I think, as few as 4 to 5. Okay, there's a couple of phone calls and things in there, but about 4 to 5 clinic visits total through 2.25 years. Our primary outcome is changing kidney function, but we're interested in a whole lot of other things too, including things like the experience of pain, quality of life, other ways that we look at kidney function like proteinuria, gastrointestinal symptoms, safety, and the like. As I mentioned, quick run through for the inclusion, a lot of words, I apologize. So this is for, it's a trial that's seeking those who are able to provide informed consent for themselves, who are adults 18 to 70 years. Not all trials in PKD space actually go out to 70 years. Many go to an earlier age point, but, we felt that this was quite important in our context, who have a diagnosis of PKD with kidney function between an eGFR of 38 and 90. This is so CKD stage 2 to just the beginning of stage 3B. And they have just any of these, a risk factor, either a piece of evidence for active progression or a risk factor for progression. In our experience in Australia, the most commonly applied of these has been kidney length. So where both kidneys are 16.5 centimeters in length, or where a participant has seen a decline of kidney function of 5 mils of their eGFR in 1 year. Those are the two that we've seen most commonly, but overseas in some places, kidney volume or other things are actually going to be used even more than that, okay? For those people who are on tolvaptan therapy, and this is a trial that embraces those who are already on tolvaptan therapy, they need to have been on that for 6 months with a stable dose for 3 months. The other thing is that there is no rule or exclusion for people who take part in this trial who later become eligible for tolvaptan to not consider commencing it. So if a participant starts the trial and later becomes, chooses or becomes eligible for tolvaptan, they're very much able to commence that without any implication for their trial participation. Some exclusions, because obviously it's important to put some, a fence, a picket fence around things. So, and this is to ensure that the safe delivery of the trial. Those who have diabetes or other conditions that might impact their kidney function are excluded. Those for whom their blood pressure is not as yet well controlled, who have more advanced stages of heart failure, who have liver disease, which is not polycystic liver disease, importantly, but other kinds of liver disease because of the liver is important for metabolizing metformin. Any contraindication to metformin, or there's someone who's already taking metformin, may have seen 1 or 2 people who've come to consider the trial, who that's actually been something that's been found. Those who are considering pregnancy or breastfeeding within the next several years, i.e. the time period of participation, but not for the reasons that you would normally think. So for other investigational products or medicines in trials, this comes from a safety perspective because of risk of things like, say, teratogenicity, so potential negative impacts for baby and or mum. In this instance, though, it's because obviously in pregnancy, kidney function changes. The way our kidneys work in pregnancy, as others can talk about far more than I, changes. And given our primary outcome in the trial is your kidney function measurement with serum creatinine, that's the reason, because pregnancy will interfere with the ability to measure that. And also because, through this period, there may be other things someone may be focusing on, but this is a very personalized discussion to be having between clinicians, and I've had it many times with my own patients as well. Also, other comorbidities or contraindications to metformin, past transplantation of other organs, lung disease or bowel disease that isn't under control, and also if you've had any history of dialysis. Okay, so past kidney injury unrelated to polycystic kidney disease. So our design is that, it's running at a whole bunch, as I'll show in a second, of participating units across Australia, which we're so blessed to have, and all are amazing universally. And after receiving informed consent, the study team then reviews the eligibility to confirm enrolment for any individual participant. The participants are randomized after that active run-in period to either metformin or placebo, as I've mentioned, and then followed for 2 years in a way that is, in fact, pretty similar to what people would be experiencing anyway. And in fact, many sites, including the one I'm at, are actually bringing together the clinical appointment and the follow-up to make sure that, well, it's actually pretty much part of standard life and no excess burden as much as possible. So the sites, I hear you ask, around Australia, where are they? They're in lots of different places. So we've aimed to try wherever possible to have a hub site at a minimum in many, if not of the states in Australia. Of course, all states and territories is never going to be fully possible. And also key take home, don't start a trial during a pandemic. As I've learned, that was a really challenging period of time when we started in 21, 22. But In Queensland, we have a number of sites. In New South Wales, largely focused around Sydney. In Victoria, or particularly in Melbourne, but some of those sites also have extensions out to some regional areas where they provide health and service, such as Mildura. Around Adelaide, through the Royal Adelaide as a network, and the Sir Giles Gardner Hospital, who's also working with other, and all of these hospitals that are our sites are also working with both private practices in their areas, but also other hospitals in their broader areas and in neighbouring health districts, because patients can be potentially referred for participation. Their primary ongoing kidney care stays with their primary treating kidney doctor and or service, but can be referred for the 2-year participation of the trial for that to happen in parallel. We also really fortunately have, as you can see here at the top in brackets, Mount Isa, which is about, I think 1,000 kilometres west of where I am in Townsville, but where they're our kind of sibling health service. Mount Isa is joined with Townsville in what we call a tele trial. And this is a really strongly emerging thing in clinical trials in Australia, which is important and helps to provide better access in regional, rural and remote areas to clinical trials. And we're so proud to be able to be piloting this in IMPEDE for us in the kidney space, and hope to be able to offer the trial to a greater variety of people than would otherwise have had access. What does recruitment look like to date in Australia? So as of literally today, as of this morning, we have recruited 95 participants across Australia. I think about 4 this month so far, as I'll show in a second. And these are those sites around the country. So everyone is doing a lot of heavy lifting, helping to recruit and identify potential participants. And if anybody's interested, and one of these is either your centre or one that's near to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to them or to us, as I'll give some contact details at the end. But we're really impressed and proud of this in particular because, as I might have mentioned at the beginning, PKD trials are not for the faint of heart. They can be really challenging to operate and to do compared to other types of kidney disease, but are immensely rewarding. Looking at this a different way across all the networks, as you can see at the far left, November 2022, when we kicked off, I think we were still in like border closures and stuff at that time. It was a very different time. And, and at a national level, the clinical trial infrastructure across health services was, at a very different place then too, because of obviously the need to redirect health services towards, acute services. And we didn't really emerge from that meaningfully until almost, mid-late 2023. And 2024 was a year of transformation for the trial, as you can see, with, recruitment really ramping up, for a better term, and sustaining like that over these last few months. We have just 2 months left to go in terms of recruitment in Australia, February and March, concluding on the very last day of March. And our aim is to, first of all, get to attain over 100 recruits at a minimum. Ideally, we'd love to get to 120 if at all possible. Initially, when we started out, we were aiming to 150, and we think if we'd had enough time, we might have gotten there if we had, say, another year, but that's not going to be possible, unfortunately. But we're really aiming to try and get to 120, so an extra 20 to 25 participants over these next 2 months. But this isn't just an Australian trial. That's a really wonderful thing. It's actually a global trial, and we are not alone. We may be the lead country and received our funding from the Medical Research Future Fund in 2020, but there are other jurisdictions as well. So currently in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they're recruiting, led by my colleague and friend Professor Swetonia Green, and funded there by their national funder, the HRC, which is really exciting. At the moment, India is also funded through their the ICMR, which is their national medical research funder, and they're looking to commence very, very shortly in the next month or two. The United Kingdom, led by my colleague who's actually helped to co-design the trial with me, Dr. Ragda Eldamanawi in Sheffield, and they're funded through the NIHR, which is, again, one of their major national funders, commencing imminently in the next month or two. It is uncommon for a trial, an investigator-initiated trial, so one that isn't supported by industry or pharmaceutical companies, to be able to attain something like this. And we're so proud that, 4 countries all funded by their national funder is pretty amazing when we look back on it. But we're not stopping there. There are other countries as well that are a partner to the trial and are looking for their own funding at the present. Colleagues in Italy, who have an existing clinical trial network for polycystic kidney disease, are currently seeking funding actively to commence recruitment, hopefully in the next 12 months. In Canada, around Toronto, similarly seeking funding from their national funder just in the next month or two. Hong Kong, two are seeking local funding, and colleagues in Switzerland. So this is a really global initiative. It looked for a little bit like a very Commonwealth kind of initiative, but even that is expanding out now. And organising global meetings for people across these time zones, as you can imagine, is a nightmare. And we've all just agreed, so long as we are all equitably or equally uncomfortable with the meeting schedule, that's the way it'll be. So, but it's been fantastic working with this group of people all around the world. Our trial design journey, so we went from being at the very beginning very traditional in terms of our design, to now there's much greater uptake of increased remote visits. Okay, I think is a really key thing here. So phone, telehealth, all these things that we've become so familiar with in the last few years. We're also able to schedule with much more flexibility around, work, holidays, life, let's be honest. Also, there are fewer tests, and the tests that we do align much more closely to standard practice and what people would be having anyway as part of their standard clinical care. The questionnaires are as short, brief, and we hope painless as possible, and they're only done at the time points that matter. So we're not living in people's pockets asking questions every single day about what they think about the sky and things like that. We're asking the key questions using validated questionnaires that will be meaningful in understanding outcomes, given the gift, as I keep mentioning, that is the participation of so many people. We've also revised our eligibility criteria. As we've gone along, we've learnt things. So initially, we thought things like inflammatory bowel disease and obstructive lung disease, COPD, would be problematic. But in fact, we then had patients coming to clinics who had those conditions, but they were completely stable, and the reasons for which those conditions were exclusions were found to be, well, maybe not actually applicable in all instances. So we've changed those criteria so that it's now those with those conditions who are not experiencing stability, as adjudicated by, say, their gastroenterologist, kidney doctor, or lung doctor. Also, the kidney function cutoff initially was at 45, pretty hard. And we found actually there were a substantial number, a couple of dozen patients who had missed out on being able to participate because they were in this little gap just below that, 38 to 45, where we know that metformin can still be used, but our criteria needed to change. And so we had a large discussion as a global group of researchers and clinicians, and we changed those criteria to adapt to the circumstance in front of us. And that's been fantastic here in Australia, and also our colleagues overseas. It's benefiting patients in their countries in the near term as well. The key thing here is we've been able to do all these things and learn these things and apply them in our practice, translate that without compromising the safety for participants or the overall integrity of or the design of the trial and how we're doing it. We've been able to adapt and become pragmatic. And like with all things, we start very restrictive and pent up, and we've become comfortable with the messiness of reality. And that's been a great learning, I think, for me particularly. Other lessons: the trial design needs to be pragmatic, less burden on participants and site staff. So participants' time is invaluable, as is the time of those at the staff at the sites doing recruiting and looking after participants and following them up over time. Also, sites have different policies. There are different things in different places and different states and territories around the country for investigator-led trials. And this can lead to delays in sites starting the trial. And certainly, getting to 13 sites is a massive achievement because each of those sites had slightly different things. And the consideration needs to be placed upon the other supporting departments. This is obviously the renal departments are quite key and core in this, but there are also other departments. Hospitals are big, busy, complicated places. Pharmacy, who dispense the medicine for a trial. Pathology, who do the tests to monitor the trial, are so key. And engaging with them through sites has been so important. And lastly, to expect the unexpected. Oh my gosh, I get asked questions I could never have imagined I would be asked as to, oh my gosh, is this something that's related to the trial, or could this potential participant take part in the trial? And for me, I think that's been a great experience to adapt my practice, and scientifically from a research perspective too. I think to become comfortable with really the messiness, as I keep calling it. But that's been fantastic, I think, and also for our ability to reach out and hopefully help a broader variety of people here at home in Australia, but also overseas as well. So we need you. And I wanted to put the sign there, the finger saying, oh, we need you. But genuinely, if you yourself or others you know of might be interested to hear more about the trial, given we just have these next 2 months to recruit our final participants in Australia, we would love to hear from them. And the ways to get in contact with us are either through those the renal departments of those sites I listed before, or the simplest way is you can going to the trial website, which you can access either here or through this QR code, or drop us an email at the central email address for the trial. When we hear from potential participants and we, interested in the trial, and they reach out, because this is a publicly available email on the Australasian Kidney Trials Network website, we then engage and or then help to connect those people with the nearest trial site that's relevant to where in the country they might be. So don't hesitate, and we'd love to hear from people. We also recognise that there's the primary people who we might see in clinic or who might reach out, but then also they might have relatives who might be affected by the condition who also might be interested, even if they're in a different part of the country. Okay, so yes, thank you for any and all assistance that you might be able to give in helping us to bump and really uplift the participation in this trial here in Australia over the next 2 months. Last but not least, the key thing about trials is they're a real team muck-in kind of activity. There is an immense number of people involved in things like this, and you get for yourselves, you get a joker like me coming on to talk through what's going on, but there's a whole circus behind us, and I'd like to particularly pay strong thanks to them here specifically. Some of those lead people who I work with very closely. So top left here, absolutely like to call out and acknowledge and thank immensely Misa Matsuyama and Push, who are the two key people from the Australasian Kidney Trials Network who have brought this trial to life and driven it operationally, and without whom it could not be the success that it is becoming. Melissa Fernandez, who has been the program manager for the Australasian Kidney Trials Network, who's moving on shortly to new challenges, but has been just the most amazing person to work with, and so can do. And then Chirani and Lisa from the data team, who, again, there's a lot of data behind here, and the systems, the electronic systems, don't just magically come into being, and they make this also all work both here and overseas, and are fantastic. And Gabor on the far right, who is our statistician, who, again, powering estimates and statistics in trials is the dark arts. We need to be honest, and that is not my specialty. But Gabor is amazing in making that accessible for us. And on the bottom line here, my clinical colleagues, Professor David Johnson, Professor Carm Hawley, recently retired, Associate Professor Andrea Vicelli, Dr. Ragda El-Daminawi, Thomas from previously at the University of Cambridge, and Professor Swatonia Green from New Zealand, who have been just fantastic and amazing in helping bring the trial to life, as well as the entire AKTN team, everybody at PKD Australia, who have been steadfast partners in this trial from literally 2016 to now, as well as PKD International, PKD Charity UK, all the site staff and investigators and collaborators. And at this point as well, I think it's an important thing to acknowledge the key input as well that was provided to this trial by Tess Harris, whose memory lives on through this and so many other things in the PKD world. But Tess was a key member and believer in this trial, an investigator in this trial, until her unfortunate passing about a year ago. But Tess helped us to design the trial, gave a very real patient perspective as a patient herself, and has been a steadfast champion for patients in terms of how we deliver and design the trial. So I'd like to pay a special honour and acknowledgement to her for her contributions in this trial. And with that, Jess, I think I might stop yabbering on. I could talk all day, right? So, which is probably not healthy. But it'd be lovely to take some questions if there might be any to be able to, share.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. That was truly fantastic. You have just made the whole process of a clinical trial and this particular clinical trial very approachable and understandable. I feel we have been well equipped, so thank you for that. A few questions have come through, so I'm just going to start with the most recent one, a very good question. If other countries have not yet started, why is enrollment ceasing in Australia in just 2 months' time?
Great question. So these things kind of cantilever on top of each other. So we were very fortunate, for whatever mystical reason, when we applied for our underpinning grant, and received that in 2020, that was our kind of our click of the go button, for instance. But these grants we have to apply for and be peer reviewed and become competitive in. You don't always get it first time. So in New Zealand, for instance, that was second time lucky, despite being very well scored first time. Similarly in the UK. So those are the reasons why those have been extended. Their start has been a little bit later. At the same time, it's probably not a bad thing because they've actually learned from our experience. And the trial, I would argue, is a better trial now than it was at the beginning when we were starting out. And that makes it safer for participants. Why are we ending in 2 months? So all things are finite in life, unfortunately, including research grants. And our research grant has a defined time period to it, which has been very generously extended for us to extend recruitment by the Medical Research Future Fund here in Australia. But the extent that can be included has now reached the end. So for us to be able to complete the follow-up time for those participants in Australia within the grant period, when we have to be paying for the consumables, site payments, participants, the medicine, all that kind of stuff, that's why it stops in about 2 months. So that's why, I wish it could go longer too, but, I'm very comfortable with the situation we find ourselves in.
Okay, thank you. Another question, I think, can you make a comment on the discrepancy between studies and clinical outcomes of metformin? Even the latest KIDGO recommendations are not including it yet.
So I was one of the co-authors of the KDIGO guidelines and actually was one of the authors in the therapeutic section. Of course, my conflicts of interest are all listed in those guidelines. So the key reason that metformin, along with a number of other proposed medicines, are not included, other than that they need to be further research like this trial needs to be done, is because the evidence of effectiveness is not there yet. That is not the same thing as the absence of effectiveness. So a trial like this is what shows that a potential effectiveness for it to be used. If we don't know that a medicine is effective, it would be unethical and inappropriate for us to use it for patients where there's potential, some side effect profile. So that's why this is one of those next frontiers. When you look at the burden of evidence of, the number of preclinical studies that have been done looking at things like metformin's at the lead of the pack in terms of the number of previous studies saying that we need to do a definitive trial to answer this question, hence why we've done this one. Will it work? Will it not? I don't think anyone can say until the end of the trial. And we're certainly blinded to those outcomes at this time. So, I think there's good reasons, and it's been why it's been placed as it has been as a future research direction for these current ADPKD guidelines from KDIGO. That may change as this evidence comes to light over the next decade. But importantly, the IMPEDE-PKD trial, we probably won't have final outcomes to the back end of the decade because of all the jurisdictions taking part.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And another question, can metformin or ACEI, I'm not sure what that one stands for, decrease urine output in patients on tolvaptan?
That's a fantastic question. So this is the one thing, the most major or frequent side effect of tolvaptan use is polyuria, which can be really debilitating and limiting for many people. Now, there is some preclinical evidence, and it is preclinical evidence, of some agents like metformin, and particularly something ironically a diuretic called thiazides, potentially mitigating or minimizing the polyuria that's experienced. Whether that works in a human setting, so obviously mice and human are not quite the same, is currently being investigated in a trial in Europe. Okay, but metformin may very well actually help to mitigate. And as I've kind of mentioned once or twice, we're thinking of a future in which there's not just one treatment, there's multiple treatments, and they're not mutually exclusive. They might be used together. So that kind of suite, like, the ACE inhibitors that have been mentioned, the way we treat high blood pressure isn't just with one medicine. For some patients, and in fact, many patients, unfortunately, with kidney disease and PKD, it's with a multitude of medicines working in different ways. And that might be one way we end up treating polycystic kidney disease, hopefully in the 2030s.
Fantastic, thank you. This next question relates to, I think, more the phase 2 of the trial, or phase 1 with the mice.
Yes.
Do the mice that are used have PKD on their kidneys naturally, or is it introduced?
So both have been done. So what we call a conditional model, where the condition is induced, where they're at risk, and there's something that's done, and so the defect in the gene is postnatally commenced, but also where it's a germline, so meaning it's in the gene from the very get-go, have been looked at. So both of those have been looked at. Now, as I said, in the mouse model world, there's a lot of conjecture about which of them is most appropriate to model human disease. And there's all kinds of jokes we could make about mice and humans and their relative similarity or not, and anecdotal evidence to the pro or con of that. But at the end of the day, the burden of evidence there is telling us that there is enough of a likelihood that there may very well be to proceed to human trials. And the phase 2 trials, I think, have been a fantastic foundation to tell us, yes, keep going. In fact, whilst they were underpowered, they do suggest that maybe there might be something here to find. And we have a kind of a tentative plan at the end of the trial to what we call meta-analyze, where their findings and our findings get combined together to see, well, does that increase the power and potentially give us an even clearer answer to the fundamental question we have.
Okay, thank you. One more question at this point. Again, everybody, if you have questions, now is the time to put them in the Q&A. So you just said that considering that we may not get results from this trial until the end of the decade, are you planning any interim analyses?
Absolutely. This is a great question. So all trials have a DSMB, so which is a safety monitoring board. And ours meets about, every 6 to 12 months, depending on situation, but generally a minimum of every year. That importantly, we report to that board, but we are not that board. That board sees what we call unblinded information. So a statistician who's independent of us, but employed by the trial. Again, this is another one of those expenses that the grants are required for us to deliver. Basically looks at the evidence and the data that's been generated in an unblinded way. So they can see who's been on metformin, who's not been, who's been naughty, who's been nice, whatever, for Christmas. And they can do a preliminary analysis. And that's for a few reasons. One is, I think, as has been really asked about, is there sufficient efficacy that actually continuing with the trial is not appropriate, because it clearly shows that it's doing what we think it is, and actually the trial should be stopped because it's clearly effective. Or the other side of that coin is it clearly futile? We're not seeing any signal whatsoever of any change, no nothing. And thus the global steering committee for the trial might consider stopping the trial. Now, in the absence of a safety signal in general, a trial will continue unless there's woeful futility with harm or something like that. But, we would generally allow, generally a trial like this continues, but it will be if there is a clear signal that emerges of effectiveness, the trial may be recommended for cessation. We've seen that with some other trials, and as people may have seen, both largely outside of the PKD space. So some of the SGLT2 inhibitors and stuff, those trials have stopped early because their DSMB-based interim analyses showed clear effectiveness, and thus it's unethical to continue in a trial setting because half those participants aren't getting the medicine and so aren't getting the benefits of it, but we can clearly see it works. So those trials stop early. Metformin, we don't know. We're expecting, we've powered the trial for a fairly modest and conservative effect size. So we think it's going to take a lot of participants over, the full almost 2 years of their participation to see a signal. Having said that, our very first participants who enrolled in the trial at the very end of 2022, early 23, are actually coming off trial in the next, 6 months. Okay, and that's no secret. That's a natural extrapolation. So actually, our first participants are completing the trial even as our final jurisdictions overseas are only just commencing. That is what it is. But we think we should, it's important for us to continue, and importantly for those patients in the interim, given there is a therapy that might be available, tolvaptan, for those things to be considered, and for those participants as well when they come off IMPEDE. We are hoping that there will be more trials that are emerging for PKD that they might consider participating in subsequently.
Fantastic. Okay. And then I guess for me, one last personal question for you is, having accidentally fallen into this role of leading a clinical trial, would you do it again?
Oh my gosh. So we joked about this morning. It's like you've got a crystal ball, and I wouldn't not do it, but I don't, but yeah, wow, it's been a ride.
It
Uh,
sounds like it.
it's because most of my work, and research work is in largely clinical cohort studies and in genomic medicine and precision medicine and that space. So this is way away from that, right? But I think it's great. And I would do it again definitively, I think, because it's interesting. It's great. I get to work with lots of amazing people, and I think they're the richness in our patients as well. Knowing you're doing something potentially that answers a question that's a really important relevance for people who I care for in clinics, and so many of the people who've trained me care for in clinics and all around the country, is actually a really positive thing.
Real
So
connection between the research and the patient.
yeah. And this is at the end of that kind of pipeline of, it's great to be able to, it's important to diagnose a thing, but to take that next step into thinking about treating a thing is so important. And I think is actually where we're headed in both kidney medicine more broadly, but also in inherited forms of kidney disease. And I hope that there will be obviously more ADPKD trials, but also ARPKD trials too,
Yeah.
over the next decade.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, that's all the questions that have come through for now. And I would just like to say thank you so much. I guess the key takeaways for everybody, join the trial. I've put in the chat the website. That is if you are, of course, eligible. And we at PKD Australia will keep on keeping the trial front and center in our communications. There'll be information about it on our Facebook and our newsletters. But yeah, we are so grateful that you've taken the time out of your afternoon to teach us about the construct of the trial. And I'm always astounded at the years and years of work that take place before we even get to this stage. And we're so grateful to you and the huge team that have contributed to this. So thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. And on behalf of the board and the team at PKD Australia, have a wonderful evening.
No worries. Stay safe. See you all later.